think we can proceed, given that we're a little bit behind, right to the floor, if there's any questions from the floor. Jefflezyne in the back and Tom Oliver.
No questions?
Thanks very much. I always hate people who get up and say, well, you know, I did a study of this, but I'm going to do that. It's very superb, Gabriele. When we're thinking about, you know, the fermentability of cereal fiber, and I imagine, and it was wheat, you know, it's really not very fermentable. That would be number one. And number two, the colonic environment is a very complex ecosystem. In fact, there's about 3 or 4 ecosystems. And it would take a very long time to change. And we've kind of done a study, as I say, looking at short-chain fatty acid responses in blood after feeding people wheat, you know, all-bran cereal for a year. And it took, you know, 9 to 12 months for you to begin to see changes. And that's about in line with what I understand animal studies show. Months and months it takes to really begin to reach an equilibrium as to what's happening when you disturb an extremely complex ecosystem like that. And I just wonder, maybe we could, what you thought about that or whatever.
Yeah, that's a very relevant question. We also asked ourselves this question. There are different possible explanations. Of course, none of them is really exhaustive. First of all, there was also some rye. We did not utilize exclusively wheat, so there was in part rye, and rye fibers are more fermentable. The second possibility is that a relevant part of the wheat that we utilized was in the form of pasta, which is made with durum wheat. And once again, fermentability of fibers from durum wheat is different from that of soft wheat. Just to explain you how much this can be important also in explaining the effect of all grain. In a previous study, we have checked the impact of all grain durum wheat present in pasta on plasma lipoproteins, and we could see a significant effect on LDL cholesterol. In this study, we did not observe any effect on cholesterol because the amount of durum wheat was reduced because there was a relevant part also in form of bread, which is made with soft wheat. So what you say is important. That underlines the need to perform studies like this in the long term. You did 9 months, probably even 9 months could not be sufficient to see the full expression of the benefits of all grain. This also can be the reason why intervention trials are so elusive in respect to observational study where the evidence is very
Yeah, so I guess my thrust was let's not write off wheat bran or even cereal fiber as a biologically active material, which I think is what you're saying.
May I add a comment on this? So sometimes we underlook the effect of polyphenols into the colon since they are transformed. So even if you don't change the microflora, microbiota, which remains more or less the same, there are many bacterial activities which can break down some polyphenols which are not absorbed. They go straight to the colon. And they, for example, they produce a series of metabolites such as valerolactans, which are further conjugated into the liver, and they have biological targets. So it's also possible that the effect on fibers which are also rich in polyphenols, such as the cereal grain fibers, which are could act through this way, not just by changing the microbiota, but by providing substrate for further fermentation to produce metabolites.
Quite in addition to that, we published a paper last year showing that there was a linear relationship between the polyphenol content of Canadian potatoes and the postprandial blood glucose response. In fact, the GI of the purple flesh potato was about 70, whereas the white it was about it was 88. And so when we actually extracted the polyphenol and showed that there was alpha glucosidase inhibition. Yeah.
Yeah, but that would be something different because you're talking about an acute effect.
Yes.
So we were talking about a long-term effect after a prolonged feeding of polyphenols.
And then the other issue of the looking at the microbiota, we did a clinical trial in healthy persons, healthy Canadians living in the community. We fed the volunteers 15 grams of fructan, fructan oligosaccharide for 28 days, a crossover study design. We found no effect on the gut microbiota. It took about 2 years to analyze the microbiota, but we found no effect.
Okay, I think we'll go to Jeff and Andreas and then David. So Jeff?
Jefflezyne, Independent Nutrition Logic. I'd just like to ask a few questions, or mainly one question about confounding amongst these studies. And it's really addressed to Riccardi and I think Jennie. What we know about the whole grains is that there could potentially be confounding from the minerals, particularly magnesium, from the fibre, and from the glycemic index. So I'm wondering to what extent we know that whole grains are showing much effect at all, independent of those three factors. And the way I look at this from Jennie's is that we know that the relationship between the glycemic index and minerals and vitamins is quite good there. So we have the question now of whether there's any possibility that the glycemic index is having no effect at all and that it's all due to the minerals and vitamins.
It is very easy to answer the first question in relation to the possibility that the glycemic index represents the confounder of the effect of whole grain, because as a matter of fact, as you have seen also in our data, consuming whole grain, at least in utilizing the foods that we have utilized, which is bread and pasta and crackers, did not affect the glycemic index, did not change the postprandial glucose levels. So what we have observed is independent by any effect on glucose. In relation to the possibility that whole grain effect, beneficial effect, are due to a number of factors which are present in the kernel, particularly in the bran, I mean, I will not consider that a confounding. I will consider that one of the possible mechanisms of the beneficial effect. I'm not saying that whole grain is good for health for something which is independent by its constituent. It is good for health because whole grain is an important source of fiber. It's an important source of antioxidant, particularly ferulic acid and other polyphenols. It's a good source of fatty acid, which are polyunsaturated fat and protein and so on and so forth. We consider as the most important mechanism of these benefits in relation to postprandial glucose metabolism the amount of dietary fiber and the amount of polyphenols, but we want to stress the important concept that the quality of carbohydrate in the form of whole grain comes from the overall constituent which are present in the whole grain products.
Jennie?
Can I just say something too? I think maybe Gabriele is misinterpreting your question. I think in the observational studies that show a relative risk reduction associated with increasing whole grain intake, is that possibly confounded, that there is residual confounding, even though they've adjusted for, alcohol intake and exercise and age and family history and all that. And my answer to that is yes, I think it's profoundly influenced by residual confounding, more so than any other food group. And I say that because only certain people eat whole grains. They're usually health conscious, and they represent only about 1 in 5 people. And we've been saying for 50 years, eat more whole grains. And I'm afraid for 80% of the population, their eyes glaze over. So for me, telling people to eat more whole grains is actually putting a lot of people off eating a healthy diet. And that's one of the reasons why I say a low GI diet is a shortcut to a healthy diet, because you don't actually have to talk whole grains or brown rice or brown bread or brown pasta, because I think that puts a lot of people off. Okay.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you have to consider that, for instance, if you take bread and you take whole grain bread, that does not mean that this whole grain bread, at least the type of bread that you can usually get in the supermarket, that has not a low glycemic index. But still, I think that's something which should be advised to the general population because it's an important source of all these micronutrients and other constituents which can be beneficial for health. So I think although it is useful to have simple markers of good carbohydrates, if we oversimplify, I think, wanted to consider good carbohydrate on the basis of a single parameter, we not necessarily can give the people the right advice because we can neglect some other aspects which are relevant for giving the right advice. So I propose to have a more global approach, which obviously is based on the glycemic index concept, but on other information that I think would also be relevant.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Andreas, please.
Thanks. Andreas Pfeiffer from Berlin. I have one comment and one question to Gabriele. The comment is actually if you give cellulose and hemocellulose to people, you will get very nice effects on glycemia, on the insulin sensitivity, not on insulin secretion, and that has been shown in 1984 in papers and over the time, as you very nicely heard. But most of this was due in whole grains. It's 70% non-soluble, non-fermentable fiber in the bran, and this has a significant effect. I realize that fermentation is a beautiful story, which has many ramifications to biochemistry and receptors and GPRs and so on, but it's probably not the really relevant thing as the fruit fiber story shows. And that's something I think we may have to pay more attention to. And the question to Gabriele is, we actually increased whole fiber intake by 10 grams. And if you think about dose responses, that's probably too little. And wouldn't that explain, you know, you have this right effect which fits exactly, but it's just too small. And I would think it's a question of dose, wouldn't you?
Yes, certainly it's a matter of dose, but I can tell you that it was not easy to increase these 10 grams of fiber exclusively from whole grain. We have performed other studies. Some of them have been mentioned also by him, in which we were able to increase the amount of dietary fiber as much as 30 grams per day. But in this case, you can combine whole grain with vegetable and fruit. In this case, we wanted to select specifically whole grain, so we had to keep constant all vegetable and fruit consumption. And we gave an incredible amount of bread and pasta to these people. Luckily, they did not put on weight, but the amount that they were consuming every day was really relevant. But, I mean, if you combine the rest of fiber-rich foods, certainly you can achieve much more significant increase in dietary fiber. I agree on that.
The argument of Denise was you need supplementation, and I think that's a good argument.
David, you're next, please.
Thank you. It's again for Gabriele. I was glad Jennie made her comments. I wanted to declare a conflict of interest immediately. Two of my mentors were Dennis Burkitt and Hugh Trowell. They were great men and taught me a great deal personally. So it's not with any reluctance. It is rather with great reluctance that I worry about wheat bran and whole wheat, which was, of course, part of their message. We've worked tirelessly. We've given 20 grams to diabetics and followed them for 3 months and looked for absolutely everything we could measure in the blood. Didn't look at the colon, it's true, but everything we could measure in the blood, and nothing changed by comparison with the low-fiber diet. Worrying. Right at the early stages, we got people at Central Middlesex Hospital with torrential diarrhea from high fiber intakes, high cereal fiber intakes, looking desperately hard to see if we could find anything that wasn't in the pot. We found a lot in the pot, and John Cummings made a great name for himself out of a lot of very good colonic function work. But we found nothing, and yet all the time one sees cereal fiber and whole grains inevitably coming out as being protective for heart disease and cardiovascular disease in cohort studies. Is there nothing that we can measure that isn't postprandial or in the colon that is a standard risk factor for diabetes and cardiovascular disease that we can measure to see changing are we looking at the wrong groups? We've looked at the healthy, we've looked at the semi-healthy, we've looked at the unhealthy, and we can't get changes. I'm just worried about this, really worried.
Jerry, sorry, David, we must have clear that the only message that we can give to the general population is that they should get the right type of carbohydrate foods, a combination of fruit, vegetables, or grain. If you try to dissect this message, which is the only relevant message which comes out from observational study and from intervention study, putting all them together, and you want to dissect the message to understand what makes the difference, what is the mechanism, then you get troubles. You get troubles if you want to isolate dietary fiber, you get trouble if you want to isolate all grain, but you get trouble if you want to isolate fruit and vegetable. If you look at the studies in which you change the amount of fruit and vegetables in the people, you don't get any result. Even observational studies are misleading, much more misleading than all grain. And obviously, as Jennie was saying, people eating fruit and vegetables are the part of the population who is more sensitive to the healthy message. If you look at the relationship between specific fruit and vegetables and the risk of type 2 diabetes or the risk of cardiovascular disease, the results are much weaker than for all grain. So I believe that something must be in the all grain. Maybe that all grain benefits are not only specifically linked to wheat, okay, other cereals also may be important. Maybe that the observation, the time of observation intervention study is too short. We need 3 months or nothing in the natural history of people who need to change their microbiota, their ability to ferment dietary fiber. Probably even 1 year is too short. And we have not the possibility to go into that. But I would exclude that your personal experience, as well as my personal experience, will dismiss the importance of advising people all grain as a relevant way of improving their health, at least on the basis of the observational study.
That was not my point. My point is, what should we be measuring? Is there anything we can measure? Is there any study that you would design that would give us a randomized crossover design? We need randomized crossover. We may not like it, but we need it.
On that, I agree perfectly. And they should be of long duration, not even 3 months or 6 months, but years.
Fred is next, and then one more question after that.
Yeah, Fred Browns, Maastricht University. There was one point on dose, maybe the 10 grams is not enough. There is just a very nice meta-analysis out from Jiao in the International Journal of Food Science, looking at fiber and C-reactive protein. And one of the conclusions was that you need at least a difference of 8 grams in the treatment groups to show any effect. So dose plays a role. There has been discussion on reducing glycemic effects and reducing the rate of digestion and absorption. We were aware of the green bananas that are fed in developing countries to reduce the incidence of diarrhea, because green bananas are full of resistant starch and also contain a lot of fructans. Now that brought us to another idea. Green bananas are unripe. And we felt that if the cookbook says that you must cook the potatoes 15 minutes, cook them 12 minutes. If it said that the rice should be cooked 10 minutes, cook it 8 minutes. And the pasta, if it is 15 minutes, cook it 12 minutes. By doing that, you have less ripe potatoes or less ripe pasta to eat, but you increase significantly the amount of starch that will pass on to the colon, and you reduce glycemia. And I would like to know what you think of this and whether that might be an idea to address in a study.
Why me?
Too difficult for me.
Well, that would be interesting too. Now, also to note that I didn't ever seen any study which controlled by the rate of eating, so the fast eaters. Now, compared to the people who sits and chew many times the same food. That could be something to control for. And the fact that simple cooking procedures that can affect the glycemic response, for example, but not only that, also the amount of indigestible starch can be applied commonly. Yes, that's correct. I did not show you, but even by choosing the right dress for the pasta, apart cooking it 2 or 3 minutes less, will change dramatically the glycemic response of pasta, which is already a low glycemic food, a low glycemic index food. So it's something that can be done. So the application of cooking procedures and trying to pass also this message.
Can I just say something? In the interests of people who enjoy fine food, I wouldn't muck around with the timing of food. I think pasta and rice and potatoes are cooked for a certain period of time because people have worked out that that's the way you enjoy it best. And enjoyment should come first.
Yeah, exactly. That's also
For pasta, certainly true.
Final question, please.
It's Marianne Ha. One's a comment. Gabriele, I noticed you said that lignin, bran contains lignin. It doesn't. This work I did in my last incarnation. It is actually full of cutins and waxes. There is actually no lignin present. It's an old paper that we did. The other thing is a comment following from David Jenkins. Are we perhaps looking at fibre in the wrong way? Should we be looking at it in terms of plant structure, the plant cell wall? And my challenge, which this comes from the work I did in plant cell walls, some fibres are actually digested in the small intestine, so they're not absorbed, but there is the start of the breakdown. Now, when you actually look at the way you extract plant cell wall components using plant cell wall techniques, which is something that Engelist adapted, what actually happens is you acidify and neutralize the walls, and the pectins and other soluble, viscous fiber components start to change in nature, and that's how you actually start to extract the wall. So I am suggesting that through our digestive processes, as soon as food leaves the stomach and is neutralized, we are starting to actually change the nature of our fibre, and that digestive process actually influences what can and can't be absorbed readily in the small intestine.
Andrew, would you like to try to respond to that one? It's a tough one.
Sounds good.
Can I just mention that Annette Buchan did a systematic review of fibre, high fibre and whole grain diets versus low glycemic index diets, and their effect on inflammatory markers in the blood. And the low GI diets were more consistently associated with lower levels of, say, CRP and other inflammatory factors than were the randomized controlled trials comparing high fibre or whole grain.